What we're going to go over today is kind of these, like these are all from the learning objectives, right? And I'm going to go out them. I'm going to kind of pad them quite a bit, like go into very widespreading sort of context around these whole ideas right here, because it's the first class and I want to give you something to kind of stick with, right? So I'm also going to stop my video and whoever else might want to also, because we're recording, right? So, these are from learning objectives 4, 5, 6. This should be 7, right? And 8. But these are going to be what I'm going to talk about today, right? And hopefully, if you have questions afterwards, like I didn't answer it, then be sure to ask away, right? So the other thing about my lectures is, again, I often kind of give you a lot of background and context, stuff that's not going to be on the test or anything, but it's just there to, in my mind, help you understand, right? So when I have a picture of a car like that, I'm not going to test you on cars or anything like that, right? They're just there to kind of talk about certain aspects which are maybe easily understandable using other examples, right? So if you ever see this red dot right over here, you can kind of put down your pen. You could not listen or not, right? But, because it's not going to be on the test, it's there to kind of help you understand the next upcoming concepts here. So the thing about a car is that, it's often quite much easier to understand a man-made machine or man-made thing than it is a biological machine, right? So, when you look at a car, you got the whole body, you got an engine, you got wheels and everything like that. And it's really, pretty easy to say if I ask you what the function of wheels are, right? You'd be able to kind of give me an answer, right? That they're there to help roll the car along, right? And they're placed on evenly spaced around the car, right? And what's the engine for? It's going to drive those wheels, make those wheels turn, et cetera, et cetera. Why is this wheel round right here? Right? Because you need to turn it and everything like that. Why are these seats right here next to this wheel? Because someone's going to be sitting in it. Why is this windshield right over here? To block the wind, right? So anything I asked you about this particular the particular part of a car is usually pretty understandable, right? And it's also kind of understandable what the shape of it is, the anatomy of it is, right? It's round because it has to be to roll, right? This is round because it helps you turn the wheel. These are shaped so that you could sit in them, right? So all these, the anatomy, the form and function is going to be related, right? How they're shaped and what they do. So that's a car. And again, it makes kind of sense, right? When we get to the human body, right, we're going to be looking deep inside the skin and stuff, those, and looking at the particular structures that have particular functions, but it's not going to be that obvious, right? What this is and what it's doing, like what this purpose is, right? But ultimately, you will be able to kind of relate the form, like where it's located, what it's attached to, and what it makes and stuff, and to relate it to its function, right? But you could see already there's nothing like this in a car that makes sense to you intuitively, right? You got to learn about it, right? So form and function, right? The form or morphology is the anatomy portion of this, right? Looking at what it looks like, right? This thing is this long shaft, right? And it's got this kind of rounded thing at the bottom right here, right? This thing has this cup-shaped thing, right? And then as far as the physiology part, the basic physiology stuff is how does it work, right? How do these things two fit together to form this lever system to allow movement, right, of these two parts right here, right? So form and function basically is the integrated study of anatomy and physiology right here, right? So that is true for the molecular level as well. When you look deep inside the cell, which also would be, its form would be related to its function, but you look at the proteins and the structures within it, you'd come to something like this in a muscle cell, right? And what the form of this are these kind of ratchet organization right here that when it moves against each other, it's going to pull the muscle cell. It's going to shorten the muscle cell, right? So if we look deep closely at this part of this little structural unit, whatever it may be, right, you would start to see that there's this form right here, this piece of long protein with the head, right, that connects with another part of this protein in a particular manner, right? And then for physiology purposes, we look at the movement of this, right? How this moves and shifts this whole piece of line over here, right? To cause movement, right? And then going even deeper into physiology, we'd look at what these little P's are, right? The phosphate molecules, which actually cause this piece to move, right? So the form is going to be related to what it does, right? It is directly correlated with its action, right? Even at the molecular level right here, right? So that's form and function, right? And it's going to happen. It's going to be true all the way through. The other part of anatomy in particular is the material in which this stuff is made out of, right? You have a glass window here, you have rubber tires, you have a metal engine, right? You want these rubber tires so that they can, provide friction against the road and be nice, kind of absorb shock and everything, right? So that's a good material for this is rubber, right? You don't want rubber though making up the engine because you need a heat resistant metal, right? You don't want rubber because it would melt, right? You don't want metal for the window because it needs to be translucent. You need to be able to see through it. You also don't want rubber through it, right? You want a nice glass sort of thing that you could see through, but that's hard enough that it'll block the wind, right? This material wouldn't do for an engine or a tire really because it's too brittle, right? This heavy metal of the engine is great for what it does, but you don't need it, right, for the paneling of the body, right? This is a much more lightweight material, right? So all the material that we're looking at here is going to relate to its function as well, right? The material that is making up the parts of this car right here. And that makes sense too, right? When you get to anatomy in particular, we're going to be looking at the biological material that makes up your body, right? We're going to be looking like what's lining the surface of your skin, right? Why does it change a little bit when you get inside your mouth and become all moist right here, right? And what are these big hard things around here? What are they made out of, right? And it's not too hard. You got teeth here because you're going to chew things, which you can't do, right? With this soft tissue right over here, right? And then more subtly, right? The change from skin to the inside lining of your mouth also is going to make sense functionally. You want a dry, waterproof kind of barrier out here. Whereas once you get inside the body, it could be this moist kind of covering, right? So imagine if your face was made out of material of your tongue, right? It'd be kind of gross and not very functional. Or if your tongue was made out of the lining of your palm, right? You can imagine your throat is kind of getting dry just thinking about it, right? So all the material of your body, whether it's dry, kind of soft, pliable, or very hard material, or wet, pliable material, right? It's all going to relate actually to its function just in a less intuitive way, right? Something we don't really understand right off the top of our heads, right? But this is all the biological material that makes up your body, right? So, this is just getting to what are you made out of, right? When you look at a section of a person's rib right here, what are all these different kind of layers that you can see, these different colors, which are obvious in the cartoon system, right? But what are they all made of and what do they offer, right? What kind of function do they offer, right? Why don't you just have one big chunk of material right here, right? So again, you look at a man-made material, right? You look at this jacket right over here, this waterproof jacket. On the outside here, it's got this, water repellent material so that when it rains, the water kind of drops right off it. On the very inside here, this nice soft lining is going to, be smooth against your skin. You might have an insulation layer that's keeping the heat in or cold out, as it were, right? And you don't want this material against your skin. You don't want this material against your skin. You don't want this material on the outside, right? Each layer of this material has a very particular function, and it's made out of a particular material. That's also not too hard to understand, right? Because if you looked deep inside that material, if you looked at it under the microscope, you'd see, and like, how does its form, like what is it made out of that makes it waterproof and breathable, right? You'd see the pores here were of a certain size that let out sort of sweat aerosols, but didn't let in big raindrops, right? And then if you looked at closer into this material right here, right, you'd look in close, you'd see the fibers that make it up. You could look at the chemical structure here and say, oh, they're using the most water repellent material, around to make that outer coating water repellent, right? Whereas maybe on the inside, you just need a soft material, right? So all the material is going to relate to its actual function there. And again, that all makes sense, right? There's nothing really like, I don't really understand that so much, even if you don't understand what these little F's are, right? So, when you think about our body, right? Let's think about, a robot, the Terminator right here, right? He's got some kind of whole system here with this made out of metal, right? And he's connected in such a way to look like a human or whatever, right? And the anatomy would be the head area, maybe where you have a central processing unit. And here you'd have this body part, you'd have these limbs, these movable limbs, right? That would be the anatomy. The way these pistons work right over here would be physiology, right? And assuming he's got some nuclear power pack right here, right? That would all you would need to kind of understand this, right? The wires going through here to control these pistons would explain the function of everything, right? So that would be kind of easy if it was a man-made machine, right? We, again, are biological entities and we're much more complicated. And the first thing that you want to know, and here's where we're actually starting to talk about stuff, is that you are made of cells, right? The cell is the basic unit of your body, right? Or any multicellular organism's body, right? So when you think of a multicellular organism like ourselves, you could think of this cartoon character right here who's made of rocks or whatever, right? He's made of pieces right over here, individual pieces that make up his whole body, right? In this case, he's made up of big rocks or whatever this is right here. But, for us, we could look really closely. We would break each one of those rocks down into thousands and thousands of smaller units, right? So that's what you want to think of when, what are we made out of, right? We're made of cells. We're made of trillions and trillions of cells, right? And they're going to be arranged in a particular way to form particular functions, right? So your basic unit of everything is this cell right here, right? So here, over here is this section of a skin right here under the microscope. So it looks sort of like that cartoon character right over here. This is the top layer that faces the environment. These are actually dead cells up here, but then you got this stack of cells that are all connected to each other, right? So that kind of looks like that thing, right? It's sort of a bunch of cells all stuck together, right? That's what you want to think of. We're made up of little units, right? So I want to kind of give you a sense of all this. I'm going to shut this noise off, right? So I just want to kind of give you an idea of the scale we're talking about when I'm saying we're made of cells and parts and stuff like that, right? So here's a human, right? In the middle right here, here's a T-Rex to kind of relate the size. Instead, there's a Japanese spider crab, right? So we'll zoom in on this guy, look at him, and then you can look at some other stuff you could see just to kind of relate. There's the size of a head. If you got a big head, maybe the size of some of your other body parts here, you get into these small things here. So we haven't gotten to anything like a cell right here, right? So a cell is certainly smaller than a coffee bean, smaller than a grain of rice. And do we see a cell yet? Do we see a cell? Here's some single cellular organism that you're beginning to see right here, an amoeba, a larger amoeba. And then here is a strand of hair right here that you can visibly see by the human eye. Here is the largest human cell in the body, or in the female body at least. There's the ovum, right? The female gamete. That's visible by the naked eye. Then after that, you really can't see things with the naked eye. You start needing a microscope. So you can't see cells with the exception of this one, and that's a pretty limited case. Right? But small on this, you start to see this right here. Right? This is a width of a human hair. Here's one of those skin cells that we looked at, right? And so you got the idea of a human hair, and you realize that you could fit, 5 or 6 of those within the width of a human hair, one of those skin cells right there, right? So we'll go a little deeper. Right, so remember how big the hair was. This is your cell. Here's a mist droplet, maybe an aerosol that you've breathed out. And you had maybe one of these guys. Well, this is HIV, but this is about the size of a coronavirus in there. So how many of those can you fit in this little respiratory droplet right here? Bunch. So that's the size of that. So we're going to zoom in even more. Right, we start to get to DNA, and here's that cell membrane, right, which will be a big part of your physiology kind of concepts that we have to learn about right there, right? So we won't really get too much deeper than this, but these phospholipid bilayer of the cell membrane is made up of those individual macromolecules, this phospholipid, which in turn is going to be made up of molecules, smaller molecules, and then eventually you're going to get down to atoms right over here, right? And in that case, you're getting very small at this point, right? So, we'll talk about water molecules and stuff, but just kind of get a sense of the scale that we're talking about right here, right? Way out. There's the hair that you could start to see. And there you are. And then you can keep on going out and out forever. All right. So back to us, right? We're made of cells. You got a kind of idea of the scale of what you're looking at, right? That's why you can't see any of those tiny little units that make up everything in your body. Here's an eyeball. It's actually a fish eye, but it's made up of different types of cells that are doing different things within the eye. They're organized in a particular way. Here's the cartoon version of that. Here's the cells over here in the back of the eyeball that detect light, magnetic waves or photons or whatever. And then they transmit that to these other cells that are going to pass that information onto the brain. So you have vision right over there, right? So all these cells are organized in a particular way to form a particular function, right? Your eyeball made of cells, right? So you want to think, right, of your body, right? Everything that we're going to talk about is going to be made up of cells, right? And also the things that cells make, the cell products, as we'll see, right? That's basically all what's made right there, right? So when we talk about this structural levels of organization, breaking things down or building things up, it's best to really start at the cellular level, right? And then go, okay, what is the cell made out of? What's the cell? In this case, this is a particular cell that makes up a heart, that makes up one of the cells that make up your heart. And you ask, what is it made out of? Well, there's all these units in it, organelles, right, that are made from macromolecules, which are in turn made up of atoms and molecules right over there, right? So you could break it down this way, right? So this is the molecular chemical level, atoms, macromolecules, organelles, and then they're all stuffed and combined to form the cell, right? All these parts make that cell level right there. Now, when you get a bunch of cells joined together in some way and to perform a common function, you get to the tissue level, right? So this heart cell joins with a bunch of other heart cells and they form cardiac muscle tissue right over there. So a bunch of highly specialized cells combined to provide a particular function is the definition of a tissue over here, right? The tissue level. And then, well, let's actually stop right there for a second. This is one of those muscle cells, right? Remember that hair that we talked about? We saw the hair and we related it to the size of a cell. The muscle cell is actually one of the biggest cells in the body. And it's big enough, if you dissect it out, if you tease it out, It's actually big enough to be seen by the human eye. It's a really, really big cell. And it's really long, like you have muscle cells that are over like a foot long, right? So this is just a section of a muscle cell. And we got a cell membrane around it. We got a nuclei, we got mitochondria, and then it's stuffed with these rods, right? These other types of organelles, right? And those have a particular name called myofibrils, right? And those myofibrils are actually the contractile units that make a muscle cell shorten, which is what muscles do, right? And you could take this myofibril right over here and break it down. And you can see how these protein filaments, actin and myosin, all arrange in a particular organization to make them do what they do, right? To make them cause their certain particular function, right? So muscle cell made up of organelles, parts, and then all those parts can be broken down into, a particular organization of proteins and stuff like that, and lipids, and then those are going to be made up of atoms and stuff, right? You break it down that way, or you could put a bunch of these cells together, combine them in a particular way until they form the muscle tissue itself, right? And then that muscle tissue, right, is all going to be combined together with other tissues to form the actual organ, right? So in this case, here is the muscle cell combined to form this in a particular muscle tissue, skeletal muscle tissue. And then you also have connective tissue, you have blood vessels, you have nerves, right? They're all going to combine to form the organ, right? In this case, a muscle, an individual muscle. That's the organization. Here's a bunch of nerve cells, right? They're going to be combined in a very particular way so they could pass information one to one another, and then eventually cause some sort of action or cause memory, whatever. That's a highly complicated way of nerve cells making up nerve tissue, making up the brain or brain region, right? Here's a piece of your gut too, right? Your esophagus, which has to have a particular organization of cells to protect it, from things being squeezed down it. And then your stomach has a different particular organization of cell and tissue that are going to, allow for these cells to secrete hydrochloric acid and stuff. And these cells, these tubular cells down here, to pass fluid up there, these cells here to make the matrix which all these cells rest on, right? So again, all these cells are combining to form tissues, which are going to form the particular organs, right? So from tissue, this cardiac muscle tissue in this case, cardiac muscle cells combining to form cardiac muscle tissue, and they're going to join with other tissues to form the actual organ, right? In this case, the heart, right? So the heart is a pretty obvious organ, right? And it's made up of this cardiac muscle tissue that has very specialized properties, and it's organized in a particular way so that it passes along electrical signals to one cell and a whole network of cells, and then contracts when it does so. And so that arrangement allows the heart, to do what it does, which is to pump blood, right? To contract, relax, contract, relax. But you'll notice in this picture, it's not just cardiac muscle tissue here. You have all these other types of structures like these valves, these other structures right here, other types of tissue combining to make it, right? Combining to make the heart, right? So when we talk about organs and stuff, I'll often have you label or identify parts of an organ, right? This might be, I might call this structure, right? Like this interventricular septum, or this trabecula carne over here, or this papillary muscle, right? It might be a feature like a AV valve, right? It might be a region like the apex. It might be a space, ventricular, your left and right ventricular spaces, or your atriums, right? It might be an opening like this valve right here again, right? So you have organs and then you have parts of an organ. These will kind of be some of the terminology you'll get used to hearing saying, right? When you look up the definition, you can look at different books, right? And you might have slightly definition, but the general picture when I ask you to define an organ It's 2 or more tissue types, right? So it can't be just muscle tissue, it might be connective tissue. Somebody, so, you know, you look at different books and stuff like that, right? And you get the general picture that it's combined tissues combined to form organs, right? And they have a particular function, right? They're doing things. It's kind of widely. There's no one particular one, but you get the idea that you know, it's 2 or more tissues combined to form a particular function, right? The other only kind of confusing thing about it when we get to it, you know, this one says it's a discrete structure. This one says it usually has a recognizable shape, but that's not always necessarily the case, right? When you get to your digestive tract, right, you have glands, liver, gallbladder, pancreas. Those are all discrete organs, which you can easily recognize as organs. Your stomach, you could recognize as organs. But there's basically one continuous tube, right, from your oral cavity through your large intestine, through your anus, which is one big tube. It's a continuous tube. But there's regions that are by themselves, because they have different functions, considered different organs, right? And myself, I'm not too picky. I don't like get it, you know, whether this esophagus is called a region or a subdivision or something, but you know, you do want to pay attention to that and make sure you ask for clarification whenever you're confused about, is this an organ? Is this a tissue? Is this a layer, et cetera, right? Speaking of those layers, this is another general principle. Any organ or tissue or region that we see, it's going to be made of layers of different tissues, distinct different tissues performing particular functions, kind of like that jacket that we saw over there, right? So your trunk, your wall is going to have the skin, connective tissue, muscle, bone, right? Your gut tube is going to have this lining where the food goes through, more connective tissue, muscle, right? An outside lining. Your blood vessels also going to have a lining of the lumen, connective tissue, muscle, right? So we're going to see these patterns over and over again as we look deeper into the structures, right? And each of these tissue layers are going to have a particular function, right? But I might ask you, well, most of this is actually in Bio 145, but in many things like the skin and stuff, I'll ask you what the layer of this is, right? So there's your organ, right? And of course, a bunch of organs together, all combined, just like the organelles combine to form a cell. These organs of your body combine to form these systems, and then you get to the person itself, the organism, right? So this is what we call the levels of organization for anatomy, right? So recap, start off with atoms, stuff like that. Atoms combine to form these macromolecules like DNA in this case, or lipid bilayers to cell membranes, nucleuses, all et cetera, right? They all form these structures in here, right? And then those molecules, a bunch of those parts are all combined together in a particular way to make up the cell, right? The basic unit of your body right here. Specialized cells are going to form specialized tissues, which work together to form a common, and those tissues combine to form organs, right? Different types of tissues. This muscle tissue, epithelial, connective tissue are going to form particular organs, which again are going to carry out specific functions, right? Sometimes they're discrete, sometimes they're part of a continuous tract, like your respiratory or digestive tract, or your urinary tract, stuff like that, right? And then those organs, like in the case of the stomach, it's going to combine with the esophagus and your intestines to form the digestive system, right? So the system level, and then a whole bunch of systems, your digestive, your respiratory, your cardiovascular, go on, and your integumentary system form the whole person, right? So our starting levels, you know, the units are the cell, basically, right? And then the person itself, the actual whole person, right? Cell is made up of parts, right? Unique, this is the basic unit, and then we get to the final basic unit, which can be broken down into here, right? Kind of distinct from everything else. Everything in between is all working together and everything like that. All right, so that's the levels of organization.